Hi, I'm Robert S. Kent. Here is a story about my siblings that is taken from my written history. I'm going to tell you about all my siblings starting with the oldest. Aaron, when I was real young, he hauled coal out of Price Canyon. He used to take Dick and I with him when he'd go out in Price to get coal, and he always had us sick by the time we got home because we always had pie a la mode and stuff along the way that we normally didn't get to eat. And then when we were real young, Aaron was an avid fisherman and a hunter, and all of my excursion going fishing and hunting were with him. I remember being drug out of bed at 3 o'clock or 4:00 in the morning and taken up to Hobble Creek Canyon, and he'd spent from then until daylight cutting a long straight willow off of the river bank and taping a reel on it and a couple of eyes to it, and by the time the sun came up we could start to fish. I remember one time Verdell, my father-in-law, and I were hunting with Aaron down around Fillmore, and we went back in camp after we hunted most of the day, and he said, "I'll tell you what," he says, "I'll throw my hat out there on the bush and let you take one shot at it. Let each one of you take one shot at it with our 30-30 rifles," and then he said, "That's 2 shots at my hat, and I'll take one shot at each of yours," and we said, "All right, that sounds like a good deal." So he threw his hat out there and we both shot a hole in his hat, and he took my hat and Verdell's hat and rolled them in a nice little ball and tapped them down in the fork in the tree and took a shot at them, and man, we came up with Swiss cheese. There wasn't much left of the hats, and his had 2 little holes and ours were disintegrated. He was a stickler on hunting safety. We were never allowed to have a loaded gun in the camp. We'd get up in the morning and start our hunting and get outside the camp before we loaded the guns, and when we got back on this side of the camp we unloaded them. Aaron taught me all there was about gun safety. When I first started to drive, he was my teacher. I used to ride with him when he worked at Gallagher Freight Company. And we lived in American Fork, and he worked down in Salt Lake, and I used to ride up with him and then ride around with him during the day while he was delivering his freight. He used to have an old Dodge Coupe that we rode in, and he used to let me drive. He'd never ever say anything to me, and if I did something wrong he'd reach over and twist my ear and say, "Now, you know better, you know what that's for." But he was my mentor when it came to driving. He was great. He was married to Eunice and had 4 kids, Levon, Myrna, Naomia, and Jewett. Then there was Ethel, always the loving type of person. She was very family-oriented. I never once heard her mention there was a difference in the family. In fact, once when I went up to Delta to pick up furniture, a lady said, "Oh, this is your half-brother." She looked up and she said, "He looks whole to me." I never saw a half-brother. She never ever looked at me as a half-brother. Ethel married Glenn and they had one child named Evelyn. Ethel was the first one out of the house because she got married when she was 18. I used to make a trip to Ethel's about every 2 to 3 weeks. I upholstered furniture for people in Oasis, Delta, Hinckley, Deseret and Oak City, thanks to Ethel and Whirl of Mouth I Durl, a lot of you upholstering in that part of the country. Then there was Clive. He was a really neat fellow too. Clive, Aaron, Joe, and Flo all served in the services in World War II. But Clive, after the war, he worked for the Pacific Railroad. In the summer they iced the railroad cars to keep the produce cold, and in the winter they heated them to keep them from freezing. I was just old enough to start dating and driving a little bit at that time, and we'd walk over to where he worked. He worked out of a little shack out by the tracks, and we'd go over there and he'd flip us the keys to his car. He had a '49 Ford Coupe, and we'd go chase girls while he worked. We'd take the car back around midnight and walk home. Clive was good that way. Clive used to collect rocks and make jewelry out of these rocks. One time he was with a friend and his friend's grandson at an old rock quarry, and it caved in and they were killed. Clive married Pat and they had 6 kids, Clive, Les, Marion, Teresa, Jan and Marlene. Then there was Joe. He was kind of a rebel. He was good. He always called me Bobby. We did things together a little bit but not a lot. He married Belva and they had 5 kids, Joe, Steve, Mike, Lois and Aaron. They divorced and he married Jean and they didn't have any children. Then there was Cleo. She was really the mother of the whole group basically. Ethel left early and so it was Cleo that basically raised us. Mom spent a lot of time in the hospital and a lot of nights away and Cleo basically took care of us. I can remember one night, we lived up on the alpine bench, she was cutting some meat to fix for our supper and the knife slipped and cut a 3-inch gash in her thigh. Our nearest neighbor was about half a mile away and she grabbed a big hand of flour and slapped it on her thigh where she had cut herself and she ran the half-mile to the neighbors and they took her to American Fork and had her cleaned up and sewed her up and brought her home. We were very scared. Sometimes there'd be 6 of us in one bed sleeping crossways and Cleo and Floa used to sing to us. They sang some of the saddest songs I ever knew. One that I remember real well was about a little rosewood casket. I would like to have the words to that song. Where we lived there wasn't street light and there wasn't electricity most of the time, so when it got dark it was dark. Cleo married Dick and had 3 kids, Lyle, Lorna and Lynn. Then there was Floa and she was a little different than the others. She kind of got lead away I think early and she drank a little bit and she smoked a little bit. But they were all great. First car I ever owned was a '29 Chevy convertible, it was yellow with a black top. LT had side mounts with spare tires, one up on each front end fenders. It was a cute car. LT wasn't new by no means but it was a nice little car. One night Floa and her friends took it, I didn't know they had it. They got over by Beck Hot Springs on 300 West and hit another car head-on and it buckled it right under the door and folded LT right up and the frame set right down on the ground right under the door. The only thing I got out of my car was an air horn that I had put on it a couple of weeks prior. The rest of it was shot. Floa married Mark and had 4 kids, Juanita, Kathy, Wayman and Tracy. Then there was me, I married Jenny and had 6 kids, Sandy, Robert, Jenny, Stanley, Sarah and Steve. 6 years after Jenny died I married Suzanne and she had 2 kids, Jay and Michelle. Then there was Dick. He got messed up with smoking and drinking at a real early age. He had a tough life. He had a lot of good jobs but the drinking kind of messed him up real bad. He worked at Pioneer Furniture with me, Jack and Art, and he worked in the frame shop. He married Carla and they got divorced and then he married Joyce and had 6 kids and Joyce died of a brain aneurysm. Their kids were Wayne, Daryl, Debbie, Larry, Lisa and Scott. Betty. Art. Jack. Bill.